Hi, I'm Gar Alperovitz of Democracy Collaborative. I think what I'd like to start with is a sense of a certain perspective on where we are, thinking about the U.S. And one of which is that I think we've entered a period, and it's very important to understand and frame it so we can talk about strategy, essentially of political stalemate, deep stagnation, and decay. Now, obviously, those are painful things to say, but from a historical point of view, they force a reassessment of whether the system itself is in grave trouble. And that's a very important time in history. I think it's the most important time, maybe in modern American history, that people are asking profound questions about the system itself. And I think that will continue. And I think it will drive a whole reassessment process at one level of ideas. That has not happened in modern history. At another level, the traditional progressive reform strategy, social democracy or liberalism, is itself in decline for structural reasons, both globalization, but above all, the decline of the American labor movement, from about 35% at its peak to about 11% now, 6–7% in the private sector, and declining. That means that the power base of traditional liberalism or social democracy is in fundamental decline, not partial decline. We can hope to build a movement politically, but it does not have that organizational base. The requirement then in this period is both to strengthen labor, but I would say also to slowly and self-consciously rebuild a new institutional base. By institution, I mean not just political party, but actual institutions. Now, what's really interesting is I think we're seeing in the Occupy movement, but all around the country, a certain awareness of this which hasn't become strategic, but it has become aware. And what I mean by that is we're seeing, for instance, in the new public banking institution movement, attempts at the neighborhood level, at the city level. I think we've talked about this earlier in San Francisco and places like Portland. At the state level, 15 states are considering legislation institutionally for public banks. Now, this is a beginning point. Notice to the degree we achieve this, we begin to displace traditional corporate centers of finance. And that's an important strategic concept. Displacement, not simply reform, and not simply regulation. The paradigm shift is displacement, and the strategic idea is in a context of evolution, of decay, a certain evolutionary reconstruction, institution by institution by institution. Another 15 states have single-payer legislation on the horizon. And again, to the degree we get single-payer, we displace, literally, the institution piece by piece of the private insurance company. Get the concept. Also at the grassroots level, in many, many cities, and we've been studying this a great deal, thousands, literally thousands of worker-owned companies and co-ops exist. Few of them are as yet politicized, but in the United States there are some 10 million people involved in such institutions, 3 million more than are in labor unions in the private sector. There are 140 million Americans involved in one or another co-op. Most people don't realize it. Very little political process yet. But these are institutional bases, and to the degree we build them up, we begin to establish the preconditions, I would argue, of a power base. Now, you can't even open this discussion without thinking about strategy over 2 or 3 decades of laying the foundations for a very different perspective on where we're going. That's the hard part, because as the decline of labor has eviscerated the base, it isn't only corporate power, it's the radical decline of labor. That means we have a historic decade by decade reconstruction from the bottom up to do, or we can't move on. So that's part and parcel of how I would begin the discussion. Secondly, I would argue that we must now begin to face the concentration of capital wealth. And again, there are many ways to come at this, but wealth is far, far more concentrated than income. The figure that is most interesting to me, and this has been checked several times, I didn't believe it when I first heard it, the top 400 people, 400 individuals, have more wealth than the bottom 160 million individuals. That's a concentration of wealth that is literally medieval in scope and scale. So the kinds of things I've been mentioning, worker-owned companies, co-ops, different forms of public banking, are also not only institutional, slow building power base, they alter the paradigm by democratizing in ordinary everyday life, by democratizing capital and putting forth a new paradigm. Strategically, we not only need to talk about evolutionary reconstruction in a context of stalemate, stagnation, and decay, but also changing the paradigm, not simply, as it used to be put by Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, countervailing corporate power. That game depended upon strong labor. We must do as much of that as we can. But actually beginning through a process over time of displacing piece by piece, I think is the name of the game. At the national level, I think we are going to see new financial crises. And when that happens, at some point the anger will bring about breaking up the big guys. And then the big guys will regroup as the big fish eat the little fish. And at some point that process, I think, leads to public national banking along with public banks, state, local level over time as a new paradigm. And again, slow displacement. Again, slow displacement, the medical system, one way or another, given the cost problems, no matter what happens in the current Supreme Court decision, has such cost problems that cannot be solved without single payer. And I believe it'll be building from the bottom up and maybe extending Medicare. And some of the big corporations will be with you because they want to cut costs. Now, if you talk about several decades building the financial sector and the health sector, you have 20% of the economy in health alone, and banking also. That plus building from the bottom, I think, gives you the starting point of a different vision that opens the way to work both walking on two legs, traditional reform plus reconstruction. A final point, in cities like Cleveland, but many other cities around the country, we're seeing organizing efforts driven by the pain and driven by the failure in many, many cities that are beginning to put together unusual worker co-ops, worker forms of ownership, and in the Cleveland model, which is happening in many cities, an innovation that takes us beyond that. For those of you who don't know about the Cleveland model, there are now several major worker-owned co-ops, in part designed on the Mondragon model, but critically, and here I agree with Joel, cities are critical. Critically, they are linked together with a revolving fund so that they each put in part of their profits in order to finance new worker-owned companies in that community. So we're getting beyond one by one co-ops. There is a complex of co-ops, worker-owned co-ops, also linked together by a nonprofit structure that begins to look at the entire community rather than making a couple guys rich or a couple companies rich. That model takes us well beyond, it builds on co-op history, it builds on Mondragon history, but it takes us beyond to consider the notion of the city and the community and the neighborhood and rebuilding. It also transforms in everyday life the ownership of capital and democratizes capital. What is really interesting, particularly in many of the old cities, is that big hospitals and big universities cannot leave these areas the way big corporations can come in, get a big tax break, and go out. What happens in these communities, and this is another breakthrough in terms of paradigm shift, in that area, the area of Cleveland, we're talking about 40,000 people in this neighborhood. The purchasing power of big banks, big hospitals, big universities is $3 billion a year. $3 billion, not million. None of it, and that's not including salaries and not including construction. Who do they buy from? And notice carefully, education and healthcare, great deal of that money is taxpayer-financed money. In the Cleveland model, and it's happening in many parts of the country, you're seeing the use of that public funding directed to help build these worker co-ops. And the paradigm thus is community-wide, but also anchored in terms of its market to begin building and leveraging the anchor institutions, universities and hospitals, but also the taxpayer money. All of them also are green. So there's a green large-scale industrial laundry, perhaps the greenest ecologically in that area of the country, uses about a third of the water and heat for the laundry. There's a solar installation co-op, which is online to put in more, these are not small, put in more solar capacity than exists in the whole state of Ohio over the next few years. There is just about to open a greenhouse, again, partly solar greenhouse, and again, large scale, 3 million heads of lettuce a year. So you're beginning to develop models, and many parts of the country are also, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, other parts around the country that are beginning to build this and using the existing capacity to leverage a new paradigm. In order to return, though, I think that can be done in many parts of the country. It's very practical. At the local level, it brings in small businessmen, the tax base, the mayor, everybody benefits at the local level, and yet it opens a new vision and paradigm of how to democratize American capital in a really decentralized way. So we're talking in this instance of another model on the ground that begins to give you a vision, changing the ownership of capital, slowly displacing, in this case, giving the mayor an alternative to job creation by tax benefits for some large corporations. It slowly begins to change the paradigm and the model, and it begins also to build an alliance base politically with traditional progressive strategy. I'm a historian and a political economist. I'm interested in how, over time, the foundations of the next great progressive era can begin to be built. So I see these developments primarily because of the failing paradigm that we came up with, the progressive labor-based paradigm. Because of its failure, we're generating reassessments. The Occupy movement is deeply involved in co-ops and changing where the money goes and finance. There is the beginning possibility of a different vision that says owning and controlling and democratizing capital in a community building, green fashion is possible. Moreover, it is possibly the basis of a strategic vision. We already nationalized the big car companies, Chrysler and General Motors, and when the next crisis comes, we probably will do it again, and at some point, there would be no reason that the paradigm could not change so that quasi-public or worker ownership and national public might begin taking those institutions, building mass transit, and using the contracts also to help stabilize these kinds of community building operations, targeting jobs to the next Cleveland or Detroit with worker community ownership and the quasi-public support from taxpayer dollars in mass transit. But again, it is the paradigm and the process over time evolving in this context slowly, like the prehistory of the progressive era, the prehistory in the laboratories of democracy, if you like, that led to the New Deal, that phase of development, even as we try to hold the line against further decay and further collapse, that's the kind of process I think this particular phase of history opens up for us. And I think we do have the chance, just possibly, of laying foundations ultimately for a systemic transformation in that direction as well.